minutes. Let's talk first this evening, though, to Stephen Kinsella, legal consultant, member of the Patriotic Millionaires group, a group of wealthy individuals that calls for the well-off to pay more tax. Stephen, good to have you with us. The government opening the door today, it seems to me, to the idea, at least, of a wealth tax. Is that something you would like to see them get on and introduce?
Yes, it is. And look, thanks for having me on and for making time for this. I thought your introduction was very fair in presenting the pros and cons of this. But yes, the reason we are coming forward is we believe it would actually help the government to have a grouping of people like us who are, after all, among those who are going to be affected by such a tax, saying that we believe it's the right thing to do and that actually it would be the fair thing to do.
Why is it the fair thing and the right thing to do, Stephen?
Well, I think we would all agree that this country needs, we need more tax, we need more revenues to pay for all the services, all the infrastructure and hospitals and police and military and everything else that we need and that our citizens need. And the proposal we've got, and you mentioned Neil Kinnock, the proposal we've come forward with is very much the one he echoed, which is a very small tax that will kick in at above 10 million of net wealth, of tax of 2%. That would be, a very modest tax on those who are really so wealthy.
The argument that I sort of set out there that is made often, including by many wealthy people, I'd say you're probably in the minority of wealthy people on this, Stephen, that if this continues, if taxes keep going up and up, then they will simply move their money abroad in a way that only really the wealthy can do, and we'll all be worse off. What's your response to that claim?
Yeah, I think there are two responses to that. One is actually, yes, you would think, wouldn't you, that most people who are in this fortunate position would be against it. But in fact, polling that we've had done showed that a surprising 85% of those who would be affected by this tax would be willing to pay it. As for those moving abroad, the truth is nobody knows who's moving abroad or in what numbers. We do see these reports that come, the same report gets dusted off every year and talks about many thousands of people who are leaving. But the evidence that we have seen suggests that's certainly not the case, that the figures are massively inflated. They're based on a very odd analysis of the fact that some people on LinkedIn have changed their place of residence or the place where they're based.
Is that how they base their findings?
As far as we can
Someone's
tell.
LinkedIn status. Brilliant.
Yeah, well, to be fair to the company that puts it out, they don't actually make the claim that thousands are leaving. They just say that if this pattern were replicated across the entire population of millionaires, but people forget there are 3 million millionaires in the UK. And even if the numbers that are talked about really were to leave, that would still be less than 0.3% of UK millionaires. And in fact, what we know is the number of millionaires has been increasing over the years. So look, what can we say? We don't believe the figures. We think the figures are bogus. We believe there's widespread support, and there's a lot to be said for having a fairer system of taxation and having those who have been more fortunate, most of them who made their money based on the fact that we have good infrastructure and they had, as I had, free education, free university. A lot of us have benefited hugely from this country and are quite happy to pay back.
Stephen, just to be really clear on that 85%, you've seen polling or you've conducted polling that shows that 85% of people who have got wealth of upwards of £10 million would be happy to pay a 2% wealth tax on that wealth.
Yes, that's right.
Wow.
And we can provide that to you. Patriotic Millionaires do have that polling. Bear in mind also, the 2% we're talking about, imagine if you had net wealth of 11 million, you'd pay on the 11th million, the million that exceeds the 10 million, you'd pay £20,000.
So we're talking about small sums here.
Well, if you've invested wisely, your 11 million should have increased by another £500,000. Now, this is wealth, so it'll be tied up in property or in stocks and shares. But the idea that people who are extremely wealthy wouldn't be able to pay a net tax of 2% when they'll be making returns of 5% or 10% or vastly in excess of that seems unrealistic to us. And as I said again, we don't see people leaving those numbers. Norway, which introduced such a wealth tax in 2022, saw a significant increase in the take.
Just on that point about people who have got a lot of wealth but have it tied up in property or shares or wherever it's tied up in a way that isn't liquid, would they have to sell those shares or sell those properties to pay the tax?
I think that's a good question. I mean, you could imagine an approach might get taken, as happened with the IHT, the tax on farms, that people would be given a period to pay. But if you are wealthy at that level, you must have a portion of your wealth in more liquid assets, something that you could then turn into cash in order to pay the tax. But as with everything to do with tax, it's going to be complicated in terms of the implementation. The attraction of the wealth tax is simple in that you can't conceal your wealth, whereas, as we know, when we talk about income tax, a lot of people can find ways of taking their income in other ways that aren't taxable, and that's deeply unfair on the average. Our average citizen, your average viewer, who's starting to pay 20% once they get above 12,500.
Is a wealth tax an attack on aspiration, Stephen, as its critics claim it is? Is it a punishment for people who have worked hard and done well?
Well, obviously there are two, some have made their money, some inherited their money. And I did hear the comments from Mel Stride, obviously, about this being an attack on aspirational wealth creation. But we are talking about people who have amassed substantial amounts of wealth. And the idea that they would be deterred from doing so because of the possibility they might have to pay 2% on that at some point in the future, it strikes me, as patently unlikely. But I think the truth is there's a lack of research in this area. There are, as I say, scare stories. The studies that you see are generally put about by people who are in the wealth management business. And, all credit to them, but they have an interest in talking this up.
They do. I think the people that make that argument, I think to an extent, it's not quite as direct as you're sort of talking about. I think they're talking about a culture here where it's often compared to America, isn't it? Where people who make a lot of money there are celebrated, they're praised, they're lauded, people want to be like them. And some people say in this country the wealthy are kind of castigated and we want to knock them down a few pegs and people are sort of bitter and resentful. That's the argument that's made, that we don't celebrate wealth creators enough in Britain. Do you think there's anything in that?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, and that's something we're trying, coming into the way we're doing, we're trying to neutralise that by saying, look, this is still a country that allows people and always will allow people to amass considerable wealth. But we, as a grouping of people who are fortunate to be part of that constituency, are saying we would be happy to pay. And the other thing, we talk about this quality of us wanting aspiration. We also believe deeply in fairness in this country. And so I know sometimes people will say, well, okay, if you want, why don't you just write a check to the revenue? Why don't you just pay more yourself voluntarily, which any one of us could do. But as we know, that isn't how society works. This will work if everyone is required to pay at the same rate.
Really interesting. Stephen, thank you for coming on and talking to us on the programme tonight. Stephen Kinsella, legal consultant, member of Patriotic Millionaires UK, a wealthy man speaking on behalf of a group of other wealthy people saying people like me want to pay more tax.